annual honors colloquium. This is panel 2. It's called Archives, Editing, Affect, and I believe it will have a scintillating a series of papers as we did this morning, with a lot of generative conversation afterwards. We are taking a turn in a couple of ways this afternoon. We are making a digital turn. We are going to be investigating technology's intersection with humanistic inquiry this afternoon, a little more heavily than we did this morning. But we had some aspects of it this morning. And we're also making a temporal turn. So we're going to have papers that reach back into the early modern period, the 19th century. And so we've moved away a little bit from the 20th century that dominated this morning's papers. So again, we'll, as we did this morning, we will have each presenter present for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll save Q&A for the end. But thank you so much for coming, and
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to start off with a thank you to Professor Malkachi Hewitt, who's here right now, my advisor, for being right there with me in the whole process from freshman year now in my DH journey. So thank you so much. So, model minority. What does that mean? It's a stereotype that's often bestowed upon Asian Americans, but when you do a quick Google search, these are the kinds of things that come up. Some words begin to stand out: overlooked, politically invisible, shame, quiet. The term model minority was actually coined in a 1966 The New York Times article, which emphasized such qualities as industriousness, humility, and peacefulness, all coded words for silence, to explain the apparent success of Asian immigrants in America. It sounds like a nice gig, until one realizes how harmful silence is to a community. The model minority stereotype paints the picture of a submissive immigrant population that politicians do not believe require attention because they do not get angry or frustrated, at their emotional range is inconsequential or apolitical. It decreases the urgency of Asian American issues and omits the parts of the Asian American community that suffer from socioeconomic inequality. And historically speaking, the model minority stereotype is one that was imposed upon the community to silence it. The origins of this stereotype came from a complicated history between America and its Asian immigrants. The first large wave of Asian immigrants began to arrive in the 1840s, when the California gold rush drew mostly male Chinese immigrants to the US to look for gold, and in the 1960s to work as indentured servants on the Central Pacific Railroad. Because of the cheapness of the labor, Chinese immigrants composed up to 90% of the railroad workforce at peak construction. And our own Leland Stanford made a fortune off of the cheap labor of Chinese indentured servants on the railroad. But the rapid influx of Chinese immigrants came at the cost of much bitterness from the white American laboring classes, who saw the Chinese men as not only an economic threat because they're so cheap and easily replaced white workers, but also as a sexual threat because they had come to America without their wives and were seen as single men who could take white women. White America accordingly began to stereotype Asian immigrants as inhuman, silent, emasculated workers in reaction to its own yellow peril, the precursors to the model minority stereotype today. These stereotypes had political impacts as well. White American xenophobia came to a peak in 1882 when the government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which denied Chinese immigration and naturalization, and it is the only ethnic-specific immigration act to have passed and a precursor to today's Muslim ban. The act of Chinese alienation has historical reverberations, expanding the stereotype to all Asians in America, that they are un-American, even if some have had over 7 generations of American ancestors, and inhuman, the subject of caricature, and easy victim of discrimination. Chinese people and characters are spoken about. They don't inspire empathy in the light literature. This passage by 19th century half-white, half-Chinese author Suisun Far, she writes about how, while passing as white, she overhears her employer stating that, "I cannot reconcile myself to the thought that the Chinese are humans like ourselves. They may have immortal souls, but their faces seem to be so utterly devoid of expression that I cannot help but doubt. The model minority stereotype does not leave room for humanity because it does not leave room for emotion, or as the employer here refers to as souls, what makes people empathetic and human. Asian American theater developed as a part of a larger Asian American literary movement to give the community a soul. It was a response to stereotypical representations of Asian America that lacked emotion, agency, or power, grasping for subjectivity in a literary and political field that dehumanized and objectified the Asian American body. It sought to define a uniquely Asian American experience, not independent and alien from the American experience, but a particular subset specific to those with Asian heritage. Theater is a particularly public literary medium as well, making the experiences and characters liable to influences from social stereotypes. Unlike with prose, narration or internality is secondary to dialogue. Dialogue allows a writer the chance to represent the actual speech patterns of their community as they perceive it. Theater is also embodied, giving characters' lines added meaning as their ethnicity is performed and perceived through actor bodies. Because of the obviousness of race in theater and its focus on dialogue, it was a natural choice for my subject of analysis on this topic. In terms of methodology, I turned to digital humanities to provide a distant lens through which to view an issue so pervasive and encompassing as a stereotype. I used a corpus of 516 Asian American authored and white American authored plays, as marked in the metadata of the Alexander Street Press database. And the Asian American corpus came into its own around the 1960s, so I included plays from the 60s to 2010, which is when the database ends. Because the dehumanizing perceived lack of emotion is tied so tightly to the model minority stereotype, I decided to begin my research with a sentiment analysis, which is a digital method of categorizing a word or a group of words as having positive, negative, or neutral valenced emotions. For the plays that I analyzed, I found line-by-line sentiment scores so that I could show the progression and resolution of emotion over the course of a play, and to see if Asian American and white American plays address them perhaps differently. Here is one such sentiment plot with the sentiment scores, to be read where the y-axis has the sentiment score and the x-axis is the line in the play. So a point of 0 would be neutral emotion. Plays are messy creatures whose sentiments oscillate wildly with the volatile emotion that is rallied when two humans engage in conversation. In order to find a trend to analyze these plots, I really needed to smooth them. I began by finding rolling averages when I plotted the average score of a uniform shifting chunk of lines. As you can see here, the data is still quite messy, but the suggestion of a trend begins to appear, the trend moving mostly in the negatives of emotion. Going a step further, in order to really get the idea of a trend, I employed a discrete cosine transformation. There you go. This smoothing transformation isolates the signal from discrete data. Note that it displays all the qualities of the previous rolling averages plot, only clearer. I want to point to the completely negative y-axis also of this graph. It starts at -2 as a high. This algorithm had smoothed out all of the positive outliers that you see in the other graphs. In an otherwise very tragic play, the play in question is The Ballad of Yachio by Philip Kongotanda. The play ebbs and flows with the distinct melancholy of Yachio, a young woman forgotten in her own family's history. The play opens almost depressingly, already depressingly, with Yachio's family living in poverty. She soon gains a mentorship with a family friend, an older man in an estranged and strained marriage, who has agreed to teach her the pottery trade. Nearing the midpoint, Yachio falls hopelessly in love with him, and you can see the upward trajectory there. And he reciprocates to a degree. The play is at an emotional upswing, but not for long. Yachio, still a minor, becomes pregnant with the man's illegitimate child, and he rejects her for his wife. So she, like her town's other shamed young women before her, commits suicide. The play ends on a very negative trajectory. Tonally, this play is more the norm than the outlier, actually. Plays in general appear to be quite negative, at least those from the late 20th century America. This here is the rolling average sentiment plot of each corpus, where the points on the two lines represent the average emotion at that point in the play in its respective corpus. The blue is Asian average. The white average is represented in red. They are both entirely negative. They lie under the zero line, which is at the top, which says something about the genre and the period of writing. At a very basic analytic level, the white American corpus appears to feature stronger negative emotion than the Asian American corpus, and appears to be more comfortable with letting strong emotion strong negative emotion linger, where the Asian American corpus appears to resolve them towards the end. This plot appears to support the model minority stereotype. Asian Americans are less angry, less sad, or at least they express it less. But if I learned anything from the Ballad of Iachio, is that couldn't be farther from the truth. So I investigated further. I took the sentiment plot of every play and clustered them by corpus, finding the plays whose plots looked similar to each other and grouping them together to see if I could find a trend in the shapes of sentiment in the plays. So I call these clusters of sentiment plots sentiment archetypes, the archetypal ways that sentiment flows over the course of a play. Here, every plot is a cluster, every square, in which the curves are each a different play's smooth sentiment plot. The black line in each square is the average of the sentiment plots within that cluster. The Asian American corpus featured only 19 of the sentiment plots archetypes, where the white American corpus featured 34. I've also included here the two most common archetypes from each corpus. Interestingly, the structures of the two most archetypal plot shapes appear to be quite similar within each corpus. The Asian American ones have a sort of U shape, where the white American ones feature fairly similar U shape and the W shape of the Asian American ones. While these shapes are by far not the only ones in each corpus, they are indicative of what the narrative inclination of each corpus is, because they are the most common ones. A W shape with its multiple downward divots suggests the consistent interruptions of difficulty into the lives of characters that otherwise struggle towards a goal of happiness. It is a constant emotional pendulum. With its final turn towards positive or more neutral emotion by the end of the play, the difficulties have either become overcome or they have beaten the characters into a neutral emotional submission. The W shape lends itself well to the protest genre, addressing the consistent struggles that tend to accompany persistent institutionalized problems. Meanwhile, the M shape and the U shape suggests a single interruption, a central tragedy. It tells a story of characters with otherwise typical lives who are impacted by a tragic anomaly that is unexpected. The characters then either break or they recover from this anomaly, resulting in an M or a U shape, respectively. Tragedy lends itself to emotional histrionics, suggesting an explanation for why negative emotions in the white American plays tend to appear stronger, as we saw in the average sentiment plot. Tragic events are unexpected, a monolith in a character's lives. In a kind of plot where the difficulties are more consistent and anticipated, however, like in the Asian American corpus, the emotion experienced might be just as intensely negative, but the sentiment expressed might be quieter from acclamation. So there is also a disparity in the number of sentiment plot archetypes, as I alluded to earlier. The Asian American corpus has 19, while the white American corpus has 34. Why is that the case? Well, one option is that the Asian American plays contribute to a subset of American plays written for the purpose of becoming a body of protest literature. As noted earlier, having the same goal of protest might be drawn to a certain tried and true sentiment plot archetype that communicates struggle effectively. The sentiment analysis also misreads sarcasm as understatement and understatement as positive or neutral emotion, which are popular forms of emotional expression in Asian American drama used to cope with consistently emotionally stressful situations. The invisibility of this phenomenon in the analysis may have eliminated some of the variation of emotional trends in this corpus. Finally, white American literature itself is unmarked, meaning that when a play is explicitly given racial or ethnic, if it is not given racial or ethnic markers, it is assumed to be white. In the American corpus, unmarked white American plays reflect the whole gamut of American sentiment plot archetypes. It is not aware of its own self as a subset of American plays, like the Asian American corpus is. In general, the Asian American corpus is motivated by the urge to, as playwright Frank Chin suggests in the first anthology of Asian American literature, quote, recognize Asian American literature as American literature, moving past defining American literature as primarily white. And it indeed is quite similar, actually. This plot here is a principal components analysis of the plays based on topics generated from topic modeling the plays, where the blue dots are white American and the red dots are Asian American plays. The dots that are closest to each other contain similar amounts of the same topics, which are here represented by red vectors emanating from within the plot. The term topic is exactly what it sounds like, groups of words that have a unifying categorization. For example, family could be a topic, and it could contain words like brother, mother, home. The words form topics based on the probability they are associated with each other within the corpus. This principal components analysis reveals the degree to which the Asian American corpus overlaps with the white American one. The only areas in which the two corpuses do not overlap are a sliver of white American plays in the upper half of the plot, and an even smaller sliver of Asian American plays below. The qualities of what makes a play American is clearly not dominated by white playwrights. Asian Americans share similar concerns topically. The many points of overlap of the two corpuses are those topics that make them both American. In that era of American literary and political history, things like family, concerns, the economy, war, security, happiness. Coming back to this plot, with the average sentiment across the play from each corpus, we see that this is a very gross oversimplification. While doing the extra delving as to why certain trends might exist, it's easy to read this plot and believe that it perpetuates the model minority stereotype of neutral emotion and happy endings. Shallow interpretations of both data and culture can give birth to stereotypes. Deep research reveals that seemingly stereotypical trends are the result of playwrights' choices of how to represent difficult experiences within the community and to resist harmful stereotypes. It is part of the Asian American playwrights' design to develop a body of protest literature and to create a unique brand of American experience that is had by Asian bodies in this country. Thank you. Just going to have an appendix. I'm just going to skip ahead past the appendix.
The title of my thesis is quite long. It's Digital Editing Theory in Practice, Matthew Parker's Testimony of Antiquity. Before I start, I'd like to thank, although I don't think she's here, my advisor, Elaine Traharn. She's just been phenomenal throughout this process and, pushing me when I need pushing. So I'm going to put this here because it keeps falling. I'm hoping that I don't have to convince any of the folks who came to the English department colloquium that studying books is important. But in recent years, a particular interest has risen in the book as a material, physical object, I think partially in response to the rise of digital text technologies and a perceived decline in physical media. I spent my time at Stanford studying both computer science and the history of the book. So for my thesis, I decided to make a foray into the world of digital scholarly editing. thinking about how we represent books and texts online in a way that takes full advantage of the digital platform. So my thesis is a little odd. It's not a paper, but a digital project. In this presentation, I'd like to give you a bit of background on the object I was working with, discuss scholarly editing generally, and then talk about what I did specifically. Last year, Stanford Special Collections acquired this, a small early print book bound in 12th century manuscript fragments. The title of the text is A Testimony of Antiquity. It was published in 1566 or 67, depending who you believe, by then Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker. I'm going to circle back to the book, but first, some context. Matthew Parker was a student at Cambridge in his younger years, and he was there exposed to early Protestant murmurings as the Reformation that had started on the continent spread into England. After his schooling, he was a very popular preacher. He came to the attention of Henry VIII and his first wife, Anne Boleyn, and he was made one of Anne's chaplains. Just before her arrest, she bequeathed to him the spiritual care of her daughter, Elizabeth, a duty that he would take very seriously for the rest of his life. For a while, Parker was master of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. It was a job that he absolutely loved and never wanted to leave and always wanted to go back to after he was made Archbishop of Canterbury by Elizabeth I. He took that role really mostly out of a sense of duty to the family and his loyalty to Elizabeth and her mother. He was also an avid book collector. When Henry VIII declared a separation from the Roman Church, the monasteries were dissolved, and all of the books that had existed in monastic libraries were dispersed, and many of them ended up in private hands. Parker took it upon himself to gather lots of them back up, and his library, which is now mostly housed at Corpus Christi College, accounts for a substantial portion of all of the surviving Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. As England was settling the new doctrine under Elizabeth, after several tumultuous years under the other Tudors, transubstantiation was a hot-button issue. The Roman Church believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and the New English Church didn't. The Testimony of Antiquity is Parker's response to this. The text is one of many homilies in Old English by the prolific Anglo-Saxon abbot Ælfric. It was translated by Parker and really mostly his secretary, John Jocelyn, into the English of the day. This homily touches on the Eucharist, and its stance is that Christ's presence in the Eucharist is spiritual rather than bodily, and this allowed Parker to point at it and say, look, this is how the English church has been, and this is how it's supposed to be. This is the way it's always been for us. And thus answering that awful question that plagued Protestants in the 16th century, where was your church before Luther? The book shows early modern English and Old English side by side. It was the first time that Old English appeared in print, and the printer, John Day, who is famous for his work on Fox's Book of Martyrs, had a typeface specifically designed for this project that emulates the look of the letters in insular manuscripts, giving it that extra air of authority. Since, in the context of digital editing, I'm thinking about modes of textual transmission, our specific copy of this book made the perfect subject for my project. The resulting edition is an amalgamation of digital, print, and manuscript technologies, and it's an edition of an edition. This particular book presents an interesting challenge because it's not just the printed text that makes it interesting, but the whole object. And it's forced me to think about the differences between editing a text and editing an object. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say digital scholarly editions. There's a few categories which I feel most of the ones that are out there fit into. First, there is the digital facsimile, very common, just photographs of the page, and you can flip through them at will. Hypertext editions present the text with links to external or internal resources. Digital critical editions aim to come up with an authoritative text and then provide lots of info on how the decisions were made in side notes. Finally, parallel text editions take multiple versions of the same text, display them side by side, and usually also offer some kind of color coding or other way of showing the differences between the texts. These all have their place and their use, and I don't mean to imply that this kind of work is not worth doing, but at the end of the day, none of these editions are doing something that couldn't be done nearly just as well in print. A hypertext edition is essentially what you would have as a printed edition with the footnotes made into links. And it might be easier to explain every change and decision you made in a critical edition if it exists digitally, but it could exist in print without a significant loss of functionality. Even though people are producing digital content, not much new is happening in terms of presentation style or the true form of it. And what I want to explore is how we can move beyond the constraints of print to make digital editions that can only exist digitally. And this is my final category. I call them second-generation digital editions or natively digital editions. After several months of struggling to come up with a design that I felt lives up to the standards of my theoretical ideal, I discovered that thinking beyond print is really hard. So much of the way that we interact with digital media is designed to mimic the way we interact with print and physical paper. We scroll through a web page and we keep files in folders on our desktops. It's difficult to think outside of these boxes when even the language we use to describe our interactions with digital media is so tied to the physical. To be clear, I'm not trying to say that print, or manuscript for that matter, is horrible and we need a digital realm clear from all traces of the past. I'm not that kind of computer scientist. Both digital and physical media have their up and down sides. What I do mean is that the full potential of digital technologies is not being realized because we create content in the same way we would for print. Because so few examples of natively digital presentations of text and objects exist, it's difficult to even imagine what that latent digital potential looks like in practice. So again, after months and months of trying to rack my brain for some radical idea and how to realize the digital edition's potential, I was dissatisfied. But the idea that did stick with me is layering. One of the problems with digital facsimiles is that it's just an image. You can't search the text, you can't copy paste. The text is trapped in an image that the computer can't read. There's also editions which just present the text, but then you lose the context that that text existed in by removing it from the object. Of course, you could put these two side by side, but wouldn't it be nice, I thought, if those two things acted as one? So this is still a prototype, but what I've done is I've transcribed the whole book and lined the text up with the images that the Stanford digitization people so kindly took. There's two different transcriptions. One is faithful to the original, and one modernizes spelling to make it a little bit easier to read the early modern English. These transcriptions can be turned on and off at will, as can textual notes. One of those plus sides I mentioned that the digital medium has is the ability to cater to a wide audience, to give the reader the ability to tailor their experience to their level of knowledge and interest. I want texts and objects that I find fascinating to be as accessible and useful to my dad, a carpenter who kind of knows what I do, but not really, as to a scholar. This project is viewable, by the way, at parkertestimony.com, testimony with an IE, if you want to check it out later. I'd like to discuss some of the technical hurdles that I ran into rather than jumped over during the course of this project. First, there's not good standards for this kind of work. TEI is the first standard that jumps to the mind of any humanist who's dipped their toe in the DH waters, but it's just not suited to the kind of work I was doing, and it has a lot of other problems that I can talk about later at length. The standards that do exist are very difficult to work with because there's not good quality open access tools available. I decided for this project to store my data in IIIF annotations, but because tools for creating annotations in IIIF are either tied up in viewers or painfully difficult to set up, I had to build my own tools, pictured here. The biggest problem of them all is time. Even after I'd built my own tools, that did make it easier, but took time to build. Digital work is incredibly tedious. cleaning up poorly OCR'd pages, transcribing all the foreign language passages that OCR doesn't understand, and lining up the text with the image all takes a lot of time. And I unfortunately can't hire an RA to do it for me. I wish I could. It's still a work in progress. The screenshot that you see here is more or less what I have functioning right now, with the less being that I'm currently working on integrating with the Mirador viewer for the nice, smooth page navigation. I look forward to incorporating manuscript witnesses of the testimony text once Parker on the Web, a digitization project of Parker's library, removes its paywall this coming January. Last year, I received a major grant from UAR and spent part of the summer in the UK looking at reprintings of the text and other manuscripts. And as I move forward and keep adding content, I hope to incorporate those as well. I intend to keep looking for solutions to, or at least workarounds for, the technical challenges and keep pushing toward my ideal digital edition in my graduate work. We're not quite there yet with digital scholarly editions, but I think that we're starting to take steps in the right direction. Thank you.
Yeah, you have 2 minutes.
Excellent. So first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Elaine Traharn and Professor Stephen Orgel, Rachel, my fabulous graduate mentor, and Alice Stavely for all of the support and for making this very possible, and even as I dug very deeply and in a lonely fashion into the archives of Stanford University. So good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. And for those of you joining us through the live stream, welcome. My name is Will. There are people out there in the world through the internet. This is the technologically inclined portion of of the 8 presentations today. So my name is Will Fowler, and I'll be discussing both the inquiry and findings of my thesis titled "The Grail Feeling: John Steinbeck, Knight of Monterey." In this short presentation, I'll provide both a means for understanding the medieval period's influence on Steinbeck's work and introduce his late career attempt at modernizing a late medieval romance titled Le Morte d'Arthur. Now, this is a project that centers around the book photographed here, just as it resides in the Stanford University Library's special collections. So have I for the last year, with magnifying glass in hand. This book comes to the Wells Fargo Steinbeck collection amongst many other volumes from Steinbeck's personal library. But this one is unique, valuable, and intriguing for the curious and dense emendations that fill its early pages. Before I endeavor more into the annotations themselves, I'll provide a bit of context for the text. It is an edition of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which was written in the late 15th century in Britain. Although its title means the death of Arthur, the text is in fact a chronicle of King Arthur's life, beginning before his birth and ending after his death and the dissolution of his kingdom. Malory was a synthesizer, weaving together a slew of Arthurian tales from several French sources to create this singular, unified, and complete narrative in Middle English. Middle English, for those of you who may not be familiar, is the English of Geoffrey Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, coming after the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf, for example, but before Shakespeare. Malory's Le Morte became one of the main drivers of the Arthurian legend into English literature, and the text exists in 2 forms. While both versions contain the same core narrative components, we should think of their differences as making them distinct. The 1485 printed version by William Caxton and the dated earlier Winchester manuscript, which was discovered in 1934. Now, the book photographed here specifically is the first in a 3-volume edition of the Winchester manuscript text, edited by Eugene Vinever in 1948. The pages of this volume are embellished with Steinbeck's writerly interventions, his reactions, revisions, and redactions in preparation for his modernized edition that would remain incomplete when published posthumously in 1976 by his friend and editor, Chase Horton, under the new title, The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights. These textual interventions have never been studied, only exhibited. They show Steinbeck in process, working and struggling along through Malory's Middle English prose. The Middle Ages' influence on Steinbeck derives from his early and ongoing fascination with the period. A great deal of John Steinbeck's fiction was set in the Northern California agricultural landscape of his upbringing. Unsuccessful in gaining a degree in traditional academia after 6 years studying English here at Stanford, Steinbeck became a prolific and dynamic writer. He continued over the course of his life to be fascinated by early English language and engaged in detailed study of Anglo-Saxon and Middle English. Steinbeck's first interaction with the Middle Ages, however, began early in his life, when his aunt gave him a children's edition of Malory's Le Morte. And Steinbeck described the influence of this Caxton-based text in a letter, writing, "Over the years, I have been more affected by it than anything else, except quite possibly the King James Version of the Bible," is to what he's referring. But it was not until 1959 that Steinbeck began his most ambitious project, which was modernizing the Arthurian tale for an American audience. With a strong desire to be immersed in the landscape of the legend, Steinbeck spent most of that year in Somerset, England, at a small cottage called Discove. To analyze the influence of the Middle Ages in his work, I borrow critic Kim Moreland's terminology for the use of the medieval texts by American authors, which she calls the medievalist impulse. And indeed, this impulse results in overt instantiations of medieval themes, symbols, and parallels in several of Steinbeck's texts. In his first published novel in 1929, titled Cup of Gold, A Life of Sir Henry Morgan, Buccaneer with occasional reference to history, the quest for the Holy Grail plays a title role. But overall, Steinbeck approaches the cup of gold in this text with some ambivalence toward both the symbolic and thematic function of Mallory's Grail. Later, in his short novel Tortilla Flat, which is also the inspiration for this project, published in 1935, Steinbeck mimics Caxton's summary providing chapter headings found at the start of each tale. The rubric for Tortilla Flat's Grail Quest, for example, reads, "How Danny's friends sought mystic treasure on St. Andrew's Eve." The Arthurian parallel is further realized in the text's preface, which states, "For Danny's house was not unlike the Round Table, and Danny's friends were not unlike the knights of it." As the litote dissuades a direct reading of the Arthurian myth into his work, the impulse, however skewed or morphed, remains. In The Winter of Our Discontent, published in 1961, after his time abroad in England, Steinbeck's flawed knight character, Ethan Hawley, utters a phrase in Old English that he recalls from his mystic aunt. Untraceable to a single source, it seems to be a made-up and hybridized line, an amalgam from two different and distant Anglo-Saxon source texts. This is the flavor of Steinbeck's medievalist impulse in his fiction, invoking themes or symbols from the period, but never presenting them exactly or drawing a direct parallel. Steinbeck's Axe project was editorial, archival, creative, synthetic, and reductionist. It was the most intimately engaged with Lemort and King Arthur. Unlike the strictly creative mode for his other work, Steinbeck took up the roles of untrained, non-academic editor and redactor of a highly complex and already edited text. At first, Steinbeck's work with Mallory was a concealed undertaking. In a request to his friend and agent Elizabeth Otis, he writes, "Let it be private between us until I get it done." Running through the entire project is a personal and private enterprise. These annotations are hidden within the closed pages of his private books. And although Steinbeck states his methodology as a reduction of Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur to simple readable prose without adding or taking anything away, beneath this effort rumbles a personal desire to reconcile his childhood dreams and expectations of the chronicle with his knowledge, interest, and passions decades later as an established writer. The resulting blend of Steinbeck with Mallory, the tangling between man and book, leaves us to examine Steinbeck's interventions in Lemort. My study of Steinbeck's annotations rests on a theory proposed by marginalia expert Heather Jackson, which states, "There is a net gain in abandoning the notion that marginalia are innocent and transparent. Marginalia are the product of an interaction between text and reader carried on. And this is how I've treated Steinbeck's emendations, with regard not only to what they say or do or point to, but also to their context, to the tools that made them possible, to their socio-textual history." Steinbeck's interventions in his edition of Lemort begin in the most normal of ways, with his signatures on the front paste down of the first volume. Angling upwards in the upper left part of the paste down, his black pen signature, dated underneath to 1956, is complemented by another black stamped replica signature just below on the center of the paste down. Another stamp in capitals reads Morte d'Arthur, which provides the text's contents, and on the facing flyleaf, a blue ovoid stamp reads upside down, John Steinbeck, The Cottage Disco, Bruton, Somerset. This insistence on ownership and the annotations themselves furthers the idea that Steinbeck's work would begin to transpose Mallory with his. With this, Steinbeck would begin to assume Mallory's authorial position. One contextualizing approach to analyzing annotations is to look at the divide between the media used to intervene in the book. Pencil can be understood to present a less permanent and erasable form, leaning towards a private association between the reader and the text, whereas ink pen suggests a more lasting mark. Almost all of Steinbeck's annotations are in pencil, especially his direct interlinear edits, but pen, both blue and black, creep in at several moments. As the sole annotator of this volume, his presence existing in these two forms suggests a division in the temporal or functional sequence of marks on the page. And finally, It is in Book 1, Merlin, that Steinbeck's efforts to understand, interpret, and annotate the Middle English get underway in earnest. And for these interventions, Steinbeck moves from pencil to pen. Nowhere in discussions of his methodology does Steinbeck make any mention of annotating the book. And I think that directly working in the text was never part of Steinbeck's plan, and that one day, after struggling through several pages, he started marking the text as a way of seeing the modernization as he moved along, disrupting the Middle English apparatus in situ before copying the new prose onto draft pages. This may also explain the entrance of his pencil in the middle of a sentence on page 11, where the annotations begin, several pages after the start of the tale. Here, as for the 30 subsequent pages where multiple traces of engagement with the text appear, there are different categories of effort that can be typologized loosely under the headings of clarification and modernization. This image provides a sense of how the annotations look and show Steinbeck's readerly and editorial practice on the page. The top image is a scan of the annotated page held in special collections, whereas the bottom image is my critical reproduction of the annotations for clarity of readership. Notice how a great deal of the text remains unchanged, where his annotations are placed in bold font and then his additions placed into square brackets. Why does he select certain words or phrases and not others when everything is modernized ultimately in the acts of King Arthur? We should notice, too, the marginalia's constraint to the interlinear space. As we can see, the system of markings simplifies the text. Upon pain of cursing becomes or be cursed. Notice how Steinbeck considers even the excision of a single letter as a method for modernization, changing been to be. He is also very interested in modernizing the somewhat archaic language and words themselves, crossing out wenda and replacing it with the modern wished, under the advisement of numerous dictionaries and accompanying resource books. Steinbeck also engages with the reordering of sentences by circling the fragment or phrase and drawing an arrow to its new position in the sentence. Here, you can see the transition of the language from the annotation to my integration of the emendation in the line, and finally tracing it into the published acts of King Arthur. So the sentence changes from, I shall tell you, said Merlin, mine advice, to this is mine advice, said Merlin, indicated by the emendations, ultimately resulting in the acts of King Arthur as this is my advice to you, said Merlin. So you can see the sort of apparent transition and sort of constant persistence of the annotations even into the text published so many years later. Although it has not been the goal of this project to fully engage in the transition between texts and evaluate the complete transition or lack thereof between all of the annotations and what exists now, many of the emendations, like those in the sentence, are realized. The sudden decline in annotations after the first 30 pages could be a result of the unsustainable nature of his editorial practice in conjunction with his growing mastery of the language and method. Indeed, Acts of King Arthur, however incomplete, does extend its reconceptualization beyond the Merlin tale and the flurry of annotations, concluding at the end of the noble tale of Sir Lancelot of the Lake. I thought through close work with the annotations that an editorial schema would come to light, but it became clear that Steinbeck did not ultimately adhere to any strict editorial program. One part of his editorial working in the book that did become clear, however, and something that puzzled me a great deal over the last year, was these sequences of sort of squiggly lines that persist relegated to the edges of the pages in a number of different places, including pages that exist hundreds of pages after the dense editorial emendations that make up the early part of the tale. These sort of pop up in random places in both pencil and pen. But I noticed a correlation between a presence of the marks and either accompanying editorial markings in the printed text or a significant narrative event. These squiggles are a reference mark, placed in a seeable pen medium and relegated to the page's edge. Steinbeck used them as a guide while flicking quickly through the hundreds of pages of text to find the page or passage of interest. With little to say about the text itself, these marks demand inquiry for their mixed form, sometimes in pencil and others in pen, on pages throughout the volume. Taking together the insistent ownership marks with the direct excision of Mallory's text, Steinbeck's engagement with Mallory is not only one of modernization or reconceptualization, but also one of transposition and replacement of Steinbeck for the original author, Mallory. These annotations demonstrate a battle-like engagement with the Middle English prose, where Steinbeck's authority ultimately comes to fruition on the page. Only achieving about a fourth of the project's intended length, the Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights is largely regarded as a failure. The annotations provide important and unstudied insight into Steinbeck's critical and early engagement with Mallory's Le Morte. Bound up in the complexities of his own amateur status as medievalist, in the editorial and textual challenges facing both his text and those that precede it, and in the totality of his own medieval program, it is my belief that Steinbeck would never complete his endeavor to rewrite Mallory's great book. This project, these acts of King Arthur, became Steinbeck's unachievable and elusive Holy Grail. Thank you.
Been here longer than I have. I came a little late today. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. But I just wanted to say a quick thank you to my advisor, Professor Denise Gigante. She's probably out editing something about eating right now because I was helping her with that. And I'd also like to thank my second reader, Ramon Saldivar, who I think he might be in Germany right now. He might be traveling. He might be here. So, and my graduate mentor, Amanda Liccato. She's also not here. So, but they're gonna watch. I promise. So my name is Alex Torres, and I'm here introducing my thesis, The Blakean Imagination in 19th Century America. If you were to peruse a syllabus for a course on British Romantic poetry, you will likely find the odes of John Keats, the lyrical ballads of William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, various writings by Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, and the illuminated books of William Blake, of which Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience are the most famous. Colloquially, these writers are known as the Big Six. But now, I want to take us back in time, perhaps to the year 1842. For an American reader of the 19th century, the works of Keats, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Byron would have been readily accessible. William Blake, on the other hand, died in near obscurity in 1827. Before 1892, Blake and his work was normally remembered as eccentric. He was remembered as a mad painter, and the majority of his poems appeared alongside images. He was also a commercial illustrator. Because of his unique writing practices, Blake's writing initially failed to reach a wide circulation during and immediately following his lifetime. An 1839 edition of Songs of Innocence and Experience, edited by James John Garth Wilkinson, reprinted Blake's songs without the images, but it failed to gain wide circulation. An 1863 edition of his work, which was compiled by Alexander Gilchrist, reached a wider audience. Still, the importance of the edition is frequently overlooked. Instead, most critics and literary historians attribute Blake's widespread fame, his elevation to the Big Six, to William Butler Yeats's 1892 edition of Blake's work. The assumption that Blake did not become a significant writer until after 1892 has caused critics to ignore the possible influences of Blake on 19th century American writers and 19th century American culture more generally. For example, in Joanne Deal's 1979 work, Dickinson and the Romantic Imagination, she mentions the other 5 writers in the Big Six, but she does not even defend her decision to omit Blake from the study. It is implied that Blake could not have influenced Dickinson. But what if that is not true? This thesis challenges the common critical conception that 19th century readers did not read Blake. In my effort to rewrite a literary history of Blake's presence and influence in 19th century America, I turned to the publication history of Blake's poetry in the United States in order to understand how Blake's poems were read, who was reading these poems, and did they encounter them in different ways that we encounter them today. Beyond merely proving that these writers knew Blake, I delineate a literary history that analyzes the significance of Blake's influence and the poignancy of his poetry and art in 19th century America. That is, I consider why Blake's poems spoke to the transcendentalists in their environs, and how 19th century American writers draw on the thematic and formal qualities of Blake's works to describe a burgeoning American culture. I call this the Blakean imagination, which is my term, I think. So I don't think anyone else has used it before, so. But first, it is necessary to summarize the erratic publication history of Blake's poetry in 19th century America. My thesis thus highlights the active literary world which major 19th century writers often accessed, and possible ways in which the writers accessed Blake's poetry. In Emily Dickinson's library, for example, excerpts from Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience are reprinted in an 1860 anthology titled The Household Book of Poetry. This fact, however, has gone unremarked until now, so we can conclude that Dickinson did in fact have access to Blake's poetry. But she was not the only one to see it. Her literary mentor, the critic Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and Ralph Waldo Emerson both owned the aforementioned rare 1839 edition of Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. These books, which are housed in the Houghton Library at Harvard University, are what scholars call association copies. In other words, they are books that were once owned by a person of significance. Ralph Waldo Emerson and the critic Higginson both acquired the 1839 edition around 1840, 1841, or 1842, and they shared their respective copies with their intellectual circles. But for the most part, in the decades before international copyright, the dissemination of Blake's work was mainly through magazines, newspapers, and anthologies. I offer a glimpse into this literary world of antebellum America by demonstrating how Blake's poems were used and read. I argue that the reprinting of Blake's songs parallels the decentralized literary culture of the post-Jacksonian era, where literature and social movements were inextricably related, and anthologies were used to construct the American version of an English literary canon. Reprinting in periodicals and anthologies, however, required Blake's works to be read in typeset reproductions. I argue that this phenomenon encouraged Americans to read Blake's songs as they did ballads, which was the most famous poetic mode of the 19th century, according to the critic Michael Cohen. In what Michael Cohen calls a ballad reading, an individual reads a poem in context of his historical moment and his social concerns, as well as in context of its own materiality. In other words, I argue that 19th century American writers understood Blake's musings on religion, slavery, gender, and other topics not in context of Blake's historical moment, the turn of the century Britain, but rather in context of 19th century America. Indeed, the case of William Blake tells a larger story about 19th century reading practices in America. Building off of these reading practices and material context, I trace Blake's influence on American writers. Before providing an overview of various 19th century American writers' personal interest in Blake and Blake's influence on these writers, it is necessary to understand how Blake's poems became woven into an American literary culture. The reprinting of William Blake in the United States was predicated on the American tradition of reprinting British texts. Before the passage of international copyright in 1891, American literary culture was largely defined by the free reprinting of British texts, which stymied the development of an American literary culture. Although the association copies mentioned above of Songs of Innocence and Experience predate the earliest publications of Blake in the United States, it is notable that Blake's poems also appeared in a variety of magazines, periodicals, and anthologies before Gilchrist's 1863 edition of Blake's work. These included the Swedenborgian New Jerusalem magazine, the National Anti-Slavery Standard, Gifts Books, and another magazine entitled Prisoner's Friend, a monthly magazine devoted to criminal reform, philosophy, science, and literature. As the critic Meredith McGill observes, the traffic in essays, tales, and poems copied from British and American periodicals and reassembled into literary weeklies and monthlies served as a constant reminder of the disjointed nature of American literary culture. What I find interesting about McGill's claim is this idea of a disjointed nature of literary culture and how we might conceptualize it in the volatile 1830s, where communication change was coterminous with the proliferation of political parties, voluntary organizations, evangelical movements, and other forms of civic engagement, all of which depended upon the mass-mediated circulation of timely, cheap print formats like the newspaper and the tract. As both McGill and Cohen argue, American printing during the 19th century is emblematic of Jacksonian politics, which valued the decentralization of government. As Cohen implies, the horrors of the Jacksonian era, a failing economy, the genocide of Native Americans, the denial of federal funds for important infrastructure projects, the development of a patronage system in the federal government, known as the spoils system, and the continued abuse of African Americans and slaves, occasioned a significant increase in social movements as some Americans began to strive for equal rights. Along with Cohen and McGill, I would emphasize that these social movements maintained an inextricable relationship with literary production, especially the reproduction of Blake's poetry. So now I want to point to, return back briefly to the archive, and I'm going to pull up Higginson's Songs of Innocence and Experience. Sorry, the images are a little rough. I took them last summer, not thinking that I would be using them as a presentation, but I'm going to continue now. While the reprinting of Blake's poetry offers us evidence as to how Blake's poetry spoke to the social concerns of 19th century American writers, the association copies of the 1839 edition of Blake's songs, which, as you will recall, were quite rare, offers us a small window into how Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson understood Blake in context of the British literary tradition. One can especially feel the importance of the two books by examining their association copies, as I did in Harvard's Houghton Library this past summer. Treasured until death, the books are inscribed R.W. Emerson and T.W. Higginson, each showing signs of heavy use, annotations and erased annotations, liquid stains and fingerprints, and signs of book borrowing. Higginson's Songs of Innocence and Experience even offers us an anecdotal window into what 19th century American readers knew of Blake before his widespread fame. His marginalia provides us insight into how he and his contemporaries placed Blake in the larger conversation of British Romanticism, implying that Higginson's knowledge of Blake extended beyond the reprinting of songs and the occasional cultural reference to Blake's madness. On the front page, he places the book in context, noting that it was published 10 years before Lyrical Ballads, that the essayist Charles Lamb said in 1824 that the work was only available in manuscript, that the diarist Henry Crabb Robinson discussed Blake in context of Lord Byron and Walter Scott, and that he himself read these about 1842, the year in which Higginson was a schoolmaster at Harvard University. Higginson's annotations also intimate that he knew of Samuel Coleridge's 1818 letter about Blake. Higginson writes, you can see right here, Coleridge disapproved on The Little Girl Lost. But this is a possible misremembering, because Coleridge's 1818 letter writes that he would have omitted a little girl lost. Slightly differently, and actually I'll take some time. So right here you can just see this is Byron Scott, him placing it in the context of Romanticism, mention of Lamb. When it was first published, 1787, the first edition of Songs of Innocence and Experience, and just him remarking that he read these in 1842. Higginson did that. He would write when he read something to remember that. Oh, hi, I didn't know you were here. Thanks for... I thanked you in the beginning, so. So now I want to look at Emerson's songs a little bit. So slightly differently, Emerson's copy reveals that he received the book from the book dealer Elizabeth Peabody Palmer. In addition, Emerson marks the last two stanzas of Tu Terza and marks a little boy lost with an X and the little boy lost with slash. Although Emerson was certainly fascinated with the collection as a whole, the themes and the motifs of these three marked poems reappear in a variety of fashions in Emerson's own writing, especially his famous essay, Self-Reliance. So here you can see, it's a little bit hard to see, it's faded with time, but he marks the last two stanzas, which is about a transition. And Emerson writes a lot about transitions and self-reliance in some of his other essays. And here you can see R.W. Emerson to her friend, Elizabeth Peabody Palmer. And you can see some stains. The book was heavily used, but it's still intact. And then here you can also see the X is very clear on A Little Boy Lost. It's a little bit less clear over here. But the poems are probably really interesting to Emerson because he was a Unitarian minister and had a lot of problems with the antiquated traditions of the church. And A Little Boy Lost is all about that. These two examples offer but a small glimpse into Blake's influence in 19th century America. Although my thesis focuses on Dickinson, Emerson, and Walt Whitman, I also consider the importance of Blake's influence on other 19th century writers, including Henry James Sr., not the beloved novelist. Henry James Sr. was the first man to publish an essay about Blake in the United States. Herman Melville also owned the 1863 edition of Blake's work. Lydia Maria Child was the first American editor to publish Blake's poetry in the United States. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was the first American editor to place Blake's poetry in an anthology, and Frederick Douglass draws upon Blake's The Lamb and the Tiger to describe his own state of bondage. Looking beyond the canonical, I also consider the importance of Blake's influence on lesser-known American writers, including John Greenleaf Whittier, Lucy Hooper, and Ada Isaacs Mencken. While Chapter 1 examines the publication history of Blake's poetry in 19th century America, Chapters 2, 3, and 4 highlight how Emerson, Whitman, and Dickinson established themselves as successors to Blake. Chapter 2 reconsiders Emerson's essay Self-Reliance in context of Emerson's annotations of his 1839 edition of Songs of Innocence and Experience, and his notes on the marriage of heaven and hell. Emerson looked back to Blake as a source of thematic and formal experimentation. The collection's correspondences likely influenced Emerson himself to introduce such contradictions and correspondences in his own essay collections, which in turn influenced Dickinson and Whitman. So even if Dickinson and Whitman did not encounter Blake's songs as a standalone collection until later in their writing careers, As Emerson and Higginson did in the early 1840s, the formal and thematic influence of Blake on their work endures by virtue of Emerson's early readings of Blake. Chapter 3 explores the direct influence of Blake on both Whitman and Dickinson, this time with respect to Blake's various depictions of the tomb. So I'm going to pull up. This is actually Walt Whitman's tomb, and he modeled it off of this image. And he remarks this to Grace Gilchrist, the daughter of Alexander Gilchrist, in, I want to say it was 1882. While Whitman modeled his own tomb after Blake's engraving of Death's Door, Dickinson earmarked Blake's The Garden of Love in her anthology of household poetry. For Whitman, Blake became a model for not only representing the afterlife, but also for the marketing of his own poetry in Britain after 1868. And drawing on her readings of Blake's The Garden of Love and The Chimney Sweeper from Songs of Innocence, Dickinson critiques labor practices in the United States by reimagining the process of resurrection. Chapter 4 charts a brief literary history of the tiger, from Milton's Paradise Lost to Dickinson's tiger poems. More specifically, though, I show how Douglas, Emerson, Melville, and Dickinson draw on Blake's The Tiger to describe the exigency of the complete abolitionism of slavery before the end of the Civil War. In order to do so, these writers portray their respective tigers as hungering for freedom. In order to explain how the tiger becomes an essential metaphor for slavery, revolution, and abolitionism in the 19th century, this chapter also contextualizes Blake's tiger with the Haitian and French revolutions, Africa and Asia more generally, and the menagerie. Looking again to Blake's tiger, the thesis thus concludes with the final remark on how the Blakean imagination extends beyond 19th century America by looking at Malcolm X's own readings of Blake's tigers. Above all, my reconsideration of Blake, Dickinson, Emerson, Whitman, and their contemporaries urges us to suspend our conventional narrative of Blake as a major romantic poet, whom William Butler Yeats recuperates in 1892. In turning to the popular depictions of Blake during the era, the context of his reprinted poetry, and the association of songs to social movements, I propose to unveil the identity of the American Blake, whose poetry and vision were woven into American literary culture before Yeats knew how to read. And my thank yous.
Hearing you all speak together, which I haven't actually before. I was thinking I could have renamed this Lost and Found and Newly Read. So I think this is a great panel to get us thinking about questions of transmission, technological innovations, digital new lives. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
Microphone if you need it, okay? This is for you guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Morgan.
There you go.
Hi.
You're good. Yeah, good.
Thanks, guys, for this really great panel. I feel like, yeah, it seems, as Alice was just suggesting, that this was like a very kind of fortuitously constructed group of papers, and it seems like you're all dealing with different, new, and interesting ways of approaching the study of literary objects, and not kind of you're all kind of proposing and practicing these reading methodologies that aren't kind of normal or ordinary, picking up a book in a library, taking it out and like reading it on your couch. So I guess I guess I would ask all of you to reflect maybe a little bit on what you've learned about reading, and maybe to make it like a more polemical question, do you guys think there are more authentic and less authentic ways of reading? Is reading a book online better than reading a book on your couch? Is reading like 80 plays more, is that a better way of reading than reading just one play? Is encountering a book in the archive a better way of encountering a book than just taking it out of the library or buying it in a bookstore? So thanks.
Wow, that's a lot louder. So I guess this is something that I've grappled with a lot as somebody who came into Stanford as a freshman thinking I was going to do pure English, whatever I thought that meant at the time. But I guess when it comes to digital humanities, in particular textual analysis, which is what I do within digital humanities, there are many different kinds. You can do archival work, you can do textual work, you can do geospatial work. But mine deals with looking at patterns and trends in literature. And the really cool thing about distant reading, I feel, is that it gives you the chance to study literature at the genre level or the like period level, just like looking at sweeping trends in literature. And And of course, I did close readings for this project too. And I, as an English major, I love close reading. So yeah, how I found that it is actually most helpful and most, like, I guess the word used was legitimate, is to use it to find the trends or like the suggestions of trends, and then using that as a directional, like as a map towards what you should then close read, and then see how that ties in together and how texts communicate with each other in that way. So that's how I found it to be most valuable.
So I got a question sort of similar to this yesterday at another presentation, where I think someone thought, I added that caveat about I'm not trying to say print is bad, because someone I think thought I was saying that print was bad. I was like, no, print is good. Print is very good. Print sticks around, and the physical book stays, it's much easier to look after them if we can keep them in a library and someone can take care of them. It's very hard to take care of digital projects. But I don't think that one way of reading or encountering a text is better than another. It depends what you want from it. And I think that in what I've been doing in the sort of making text available online kind of digital work, I think that the digital impulse is really, it has a lot to do with access and making things available to people, not just for them to be able to find it, but to be able to interact with it and like to get it. And so I think, but if you're someone who already knows what's up, then maybe it's easier for you to be working in special collections with it. But it just depends what you're looking to get out of something.
Let's see, that's a big question. But the first thing that comes to mind actually is a quote from Professor Stephen Orgel's new book called The Reader in the Book, where he says that so often we consider the book to be the authors and not the readers, when in fact the sort of very personal act of sitting and holding a book or sitting in front of your computer and reading something online or however you interact with that is your experience inherently, and that everything else that kind of happens there is peripheral to that. And so that's definitely been my biggest change in thinking about what is reading, and it is a very personal, private enterprise. And so in my project specifically, I feel like I've also sort of assumed the position of Steinbeck, sitting in front of this book and reading along with it. Interestingly enough, the book that I quote in the presentation by Heather Jackson on marginalia has been annotated very heavily and programmatically in this fantastic way that just entirely reflects what the book itself is getting at, or what the text is getting at, rather. And then another just short quote thing. I saw a librarian a couple weeks ago vigorously erasing with like a big pink eraser something out of a book. And I thought, maybe like what a tragedy that is, that that now we no longer have that interaction between the reader and the object itself. And so annotation is a way of preserving that moment of readership. So I'm all for writing in books.
So one thing I thought was really interesting about my project, it started when I found some Blake poems in an anthology, but what was more exciting was actually finding the Blake poems in various periodicals, and some of them were very bizarre. Like his poems were printed in this like ladies magazine, and this magazine was it was just for like ladies. It was ladies indulgement and like I don't even know, sort of I'm trying to think of what's what's a contemporary magazine that ladies are supposed to read. I don't know, but it was yeah, like that, like Vanity Fair. It was very bizarre. But it was also interesting too to see Blake's poems reproduced next to articles about presidents at the time, or if they're complaining about the president or what he said, or seeing his poems really become a part of an American newspaper and American print culture. And I think that gave me a very different perspective on Blake, and just how his poems really out of context lose so much. So I think it's about, in some ways, like reading them in the new context has showed me just how important it is to read in context. Reading, a whole author's oeuvre is so important. It was so funny to me that the Swedenborgian Society just loved Blake's poem so much, and then in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, another one of Blake's works, he's just sitting there deriding Swedenborg the entire time. So it's just interesting to sort of see these ironies that we as modern readers just say, oh, okay, that's obvious. His poem The Lamb is, maybe not as serious as these 19th century readers thought it was. And his commitment to religion maybe wasn't as serious as they thought it was. So I thought it was interesting just how historical persona also changes. How at times Blake was an abolitionist, at times he was just a painter, at times he was this mad visionary, and it just depended on the context. So I don't know, I thought that was interesting. It was sort of revising my own history of Blake and understanding of him.
I don't need a microphone unless you're recording this.
Gotta have it, yeah.
Okay. Clearly, the written word is very important to you all, and perhaps the relationship you have had with the written word has evolved since, 4 some odd years ago. I'm just curious to know from anybody on the panel here, was there a specific work of art, an event that occurred, maybe something, some other crossroads that happened either recently or in your past that kind of led you in the direction that you all specifically chose? Because very fascinated. I had no idea what to expect here, and you just took your particular specific topic so in depth, and was very curious to know a little bit more about that.
You want to start out there?
So my particular project was on Asian American theater. I've been doing Asian American theater since freshman year with the Asian American Theater Project here. But I guess I never really looked at it in the sense of like as a literary corpus of work until I was just sitting around junior year and being like, I want to write an honors thesis and I want to have this research experience. And I've been doing research at the Lit Lab, and I want to find some way to think about things or think about this theater world that I've been involved in for basically my whole life, and then Asian American Theater Project in college in an academic lens with what I was doing in English already. And then it hit me that stereotypes and the things that Asian American theater is trying to tackle is at that broad level, at that like overarching trend level that digital humanities is so well equipped to tackle, things that are pervasive, things that are widespread. And so that's when the connection, I guess, hit to think of Asian American theater as a corpus and to tackle it with text mining.
So I came to the English department pretty late in my Stanford career. I started as a math major, and then lots of changes later. I was a computer science major, and then I was an English major. So I've always, my whole time in doing literature, I've had sort of a digital bent to it. And I was taking a class last winter, it must have been, it was called The Digital Middle Ages. It's taught by one of the librarians here, Ben Albritton, who's fantastic. And in that class, I primarily do medieval literature. And in that class, we were looking at digital tools for engaging with medieval studies, and everything we were in, so much of the content that we were encountering online through that class was just terrible. I was like, why does it all look so bad? Like, why isn't it like usable? And so I was like, okay, I want to do something in this realm of like making this better, just making it easier to use and access older texts online. And then the library bought that little book, and my advisor was like, "Hey, what do you think of this? It's not really medieval except for the cover, but which is actually very interesting, and I didn't talk about much, but and so I was like, oh, okay, like sure, I'll see what I can do." But that's that's how I came to my project.
So I guess so I sort of have some resemblances to Steinbeck, it would seem, in that I came to Stanford as a bio major, and then switched to English, where Steinbeck was very interested in biology and the ocean and marine biology especially. But wherever that is going is, I don't know. But so that happened. But I think that sort of the thing that about this project especially is that I really enjoy the archive. And so here's my plug to John Mustaine and all the special collections librarians who make a place that seems very inaccessible and locked and hidden and distant, wholly accessible, and a place that is interesting and kind of fun to be in. It's also very quiet. Like it's you really get to sort of have those like private moments there. And so that is, I think, one thing that really helped me in this project was to find the place where I knew I could do the work. And that was the place where the work actually existed, was in the library. So, yeah, I think that's it.
So I came in thinking I was going to be an English or a history major. So my first quarter, I took an English and a history class, and I didn't like the history one, so I was an English major because I just thought that would be easier. And I thought I wanted to be a writer, like I think like somebody, or like a fiction writer. And I took a fiction class in my second quarter, and I hated it. And I haven't written fiction really since. So then I just was like, well, I'd only ever read contemporary novels really, and I actually just started reading random poetry, 19th century work. I read Emerson's essays, and I started finding sort of just an interest. I don't know if it was at first it was a love. It was sort of like I had to learn to love it, but then once I learned to love it, I just loved it so much. And then it hit me too that I was always interested in history, and I was always interested in the past and discovering things about history, that I could do that with literature. So I sort of pursued my historical interest, or my interest in history, through literature. And that way I didn't have to take history classes because I didn't like them. But now I know history is a good subject. But and then another thing that was so important was actually I took an independent study with Professor Saldivar. Was it my sophomore year, I think? So it was 2 or 3 years ago, and it was just so invigorating to sit there and sort of have intellectual sparring matches about poems and novels and passages, and just how enjoyable it was just to sit there for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and just talk about literature in which you could just discover from sitting with a couple sentences or words, and how that just doesn't reflect just the text but the world that surrounds us. And I just thought that was really powerful and also important, with looking back and using literature to look at history. Just, what can a poem say about history or something like that? I don't know. But yeah, I think that's it.
That, all of your answers to that question made me think about the other thing that I think sets apart the collective work of the panel from other kinds of literary scholarship, which is that there's an investment of each one of you in a non-textual medium, right? Particularly in the image, whether it's a graph of emotions, whether it's a digital object that takes the form of like an image on a screen, whether it's particular kinds of handwritten comments, or Blake, obviously, with his engravings that he puts so much emphasis on. And I'm wondering if each one of you could comment on the ways in which the visual has been integrated into the methods of the projects that you do, because you're all talking about writing, but you're all talking about writing through a very particular visual way.
I can start. So I think for my project specifically, kind of what that touches on is this need that I had to unbind myself from thinking of annotations purely as words and not thinking so much what do they say, but how are they functioning and what are they doing. And so I talked briefly in my presentation about these squiggles that appear that really did puzzle me for the longest time, and I had absolutely no idea what was going on with them. And I might still be wrong. I will concede that point. But I think I'm right. But the other thing that was very interesting is his method of striking through the words, where this sort of single line seems to excise or like dissect the text itself. And so he doesn't have to write anything or create the words, but this visualization, this kind of motion, this idea of removal, and the way he shows that was something that is also very, very interesting and sort of deeply embedded in the project. That is not necessarily something that you would see if you looked at a draft of acts of which to exist or look at the final text itself, but his deliberate entrance into the book object and then the marking up of it in his kind of ways that he does that even outside of a purely like textual or word-driven way, is sort of really the foundation, I think, also of annotation and then of textual studies generally, where we think of letters as something, but it's really just like a shape or some ink that's on a page, and what do we think of as a letter, and we put these sort of shapes together and then we call them words, and we put more of these shapes together and call them sentences. And so it sort of harkens back to the very beginnings of what text is, which my amazing advisor Elaine Traharn has all these theories about, which everyone should read. But that's at least how I think it comes through in Steinbeck's annotations in the volume.
One thing I thought was really interesting about that question is when I first started talking about this project with Denise Gigante, we were talking a lot about, she would point out to certain of Blake's images. And I said, well, these readers didn't have access to those images. So what does that mean? So I sort of realized that there was this canonical sense of Blake. And then there's, that romanticist who are focusing on that period are really focusing on Blake's images and sort of how those images, relate to a, broader history of Britain, how they speak to the social concerns of Blake's world, or the, more broadly the world of the romanticists, or the romantics. But my project was so different. It was, it was sort of, I wanted to do a project on these American writers, but in doing so, I had to sort of, analyze what was their contextual Blake. And it was interesting that, Blake's images were, available, especially after 1863, but they were so poorly produced that it was mostly in typeset. And that's interesting, for certain poems like Blake's The Tiger. If you actually look at the image of the tiger, it sort of looks like it's got like a dog-like face. It looks a little weak. He's not like this ferocious beast that you might expect him to be. But when you pull the poem away from that, there's definitely a separation. The poem, the irony changes of the poem. It's sort of repainted. So I think, my big thing was sort of looking at a project that no romanticist would dare to do, because they're so concerned about Blake's world, and his world is so complex and there's so much to explore in it. Whereas my project is sort of looking at how did people actually read Blake. So I thought it's interesting that you bring about word and image because of that. But it was interesting too to find out that Whitman did get to see some of Blake's images and how those images may or may not have influenced his later writings. So, but I didn't go that far.
So this, for me, the word and image thing is really tied to what I mentioned briefly, the difference between editing a text and editing an object. One of the things I found really challenging working with print is, because I spend a lot of time looking at manuscripts, and the thing about manuscripts is they're all very obviously unique. And when you get into print, because you have that sort of mass reproduction, it's harder to see each book as unique because the text in it is the same. So when thinking about editing this particular object instead of just this text as a whole, like the image is so crucial to reminding you that this object has had its whole own life and story, and that's not something outside of just the text that's in it. If you're editing just the text, I've seen this reprinted several times, and there's, a lot of copies of this first edition, but having the focus be on this particular object, especially with its it makes itself obviously unique with its binding, but I think that the image really, it's a reminder that the text exists in objects that have their own lives and have their own stories. And without the image, you totally lose that sense.
Yeah, I think that the relationship between word and image with my project is a little different from the other ones because the image does not exist before this project. So with the other ones, it's like analyzing the image and how that interacts with the words simultaneously. And I guess when it comes to text mining, it's more like using image as a new transformative way of reading and a new way of interfacing with the text. I have these massive PDFs, these absolutely massive PDFs that always crash my image viewer on my tiny MacBook Air that I bought when I thought I'd be a pure English major. And these PDFs are just that sentiment plot that I showed earlier. They are like hundreds of those on one image file. And I have it all there simultaneously, as per suggestion from Marg, simultaneously, so that I could look at them all these different sentiment plots, and see what the trends were. So I would just spend an hour staring at my laptop on a big screen and just seeing if I can find things that were similar, and what does that mean in terms of the text that they're reflecting. So it really was like, it's like, even if I'm not reading every play, I'm thinking of the ways that the plays that I have read interact with the images that I've created from them. And it's kind of this like weird birthing from the text into this like physical object, which are the graphs. And then I guess like when it comes to Asian American plays, there's this other image word relationship, which is that theater is innately physical, and that when I'm reading these plays, I'm thinking about how these lines are being delivered and how people receive that emotion, and like I'm thinking of how the physicality of the actor who would be portraying that and the image of that person saying those lines would also affect the way that those lines are being interpreted. So on multiple levels, I guess image and word, they definitely interact.
I was interested in the way all four papers kind of thematize something that they're also themselves doing, which is this act of kind of reaching back and bringing a historical work into the present. I mean, Alex's with this kind of these reinventions of Blake in 19th century America, Will's with this, like, very obviously with Steinbeck trying to modernize the Mort Datha. Liz is bringing the kind of addition of an addition into the present, and then Mire is also maybe more complexly kind of bringing these silent figures, caricatures, into a kind of speaking presence. And it seems to me that such work would always be divided between two impulses. One, to kind of reconstruct the moment at which a particular text is produced, moment in which it's maybe first read, or later any of these kind of reconstructions that you're all tracing. And then the other impulse, of course, to kind of make the case for its contemporary importance, for the importance for us today, perhaps, or again, reaching back at each of the moments of its reconstruction. So I just wondered if each of you could talk a little bit about how in your research you kind of experienced these two possibly contradictory impulses, and how you feel like you found a balance between them in the final work.
I have lots of thoughts about this. So this was a big struggle for me for a long time on my project, because I started off in the fall with all of my theory before I got really into the practice. And I had this idea of, the natively digital edition, something that's not just trying to emulate print. And then when you get into trying to implement these things, like so many of the I was fighting myself because so many of the things I would think of that I was like, oh, it'd be cool if I had this. Like this isn't something I considered because it would be a lot of work, but you see a lot of digitization or displays, implementing page turning, that sort of thing, things that don't really add that much, but give you that sort of more of a sense of that you're interacting with it in the same way you would the physical object. And there were a few things like giving a sense of scale and page turning, where I was fighting myself because I think of these things like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, but do I just want to emulate the physical book? Like, is this me like giving in to my own, like, am I just doing what I'm saying we shouldn't do by, trying to recreate digitally what the experience we would have physically, trying to, divorce my own ideas from trying to live up to my own standards basically in the actual practice was a big challenge, because you want, on the one hand, you want people to have the experience of the object, but when your whole argument is we shouldn't be doing that, it gets a little hard to justify some decisions. So that was a huge challenge in implementation, and I think the solution, I don't know what the solution is. The solution is just stop beating yourself up about it, I guess. But yeah.
So there's sort of two buckets, I guess, and in terms of thinking about the kind of trans-chronological parts of this project, where the most difficult one at first was negotiating where the critics were. And in Steinbeck's work, there have really been no medievalists or people who are so deeply imbued in medieval studies that have looked forward at the work. And so there isn't a body of like critical literature that says, here's how the medievalists think the medieval is operating. It's only the Americanists who are actually reading this and seeing the manifestation of these themes, who are then writing about it. And so me being a medievalist, I felt like it's a different perspective. I think the conclusions are generally the same, but I think the way we think about it and kind of the level at which we're able to maybe approach and understand the sort of undergirding structures of the Arthurian legend and where it comes from, or the Old English source texts that appear in that one line in Winter of Our Discontent, certainly has a different flavor than what the Americanists who are sort of the experts on Steinbeck have to say about it. And so that was one area. The other critical area that I continue to question is, why would I read John Steinbeck's modern kind of bad version of this when I could read the amazing Middle English version, like sort of the original? And that is a question that I think he probably was asking himself too at some point in the project, that I really have no conclusions about. But what maybe is the role in that revival, or kind of the efficacy of that, and like what's the point? Like,
okay. So one thing I thought was interesting about my project, or I think about the sort of these lapses in time that you're talking about, or looking backwards or looking forwards, is I think my first big question, or when I was thinking about my project, conceptualizing, I said, well, why would these 19th century American writers be reading Blake? And then it was like, or why are we reading Blake today? And I sort of, I found that his poems are so powerful, and their messages kind of transcends time, and that's kind of how we have the writers that we have, or why we keep going back to reading, Dickinson, Shakespeare, Milton. So I thought that was like it was a big question about why we read it all, or why we don't just read what's just being published, or why is a canon important? So I think that was something I really started to appreciate or understand, or to kind of see the process of canonization sort of occurring in my project, which I thought was really exciting. The other thing that was, I think exciting for me too, was this time period kind of got to dive into sort of like what does it mean to be studying transatlantically, and we're in a field that likes to divide itself so evenly into post 45 American, pre 40 or whatever American. So to kind of take 19th century American literature and to kind of put it back into putting it in this conversation of British Romanticism, it was also interesting just to see just how this period, British culture sort of gets imported into the United States, but how it's changed, what is different about the two countries, despite the fact that they share a language, so that kind of, they shared a language, so a lot of their literature was shared, but besides a shared literature and maybe shared media, how do they differ, how do they change? So I think it was interesting to track sort of those changes, and to sort of think about, I didn't want to just do this is what Blake did and this is what these writers did. Didn't want to do it sort of like X and Y. I sort of wanted this transatlantic to actually be real, to feel that they were both occurring at the same time. There was it was simultaneous, and I think that was something I struggled with. To remember that there was still a Britain in 1850, that Blake was still a person, and that Blake was dead, but he was actually a person. Kind of remembering these historical things, I found it was difficult to navigate, but exciting. That's all I'm going to say about it.
I know, Alec, you had mentioned the word canon, and that's something that I would think a lot about when I was doing my thesis, because the body of literature that I'm working with, the corpus that I'm working with, is the Asian American theater corpus, and this is something that many people don't even really know exists at all, but like it's so expansive, and despite having begun only in 1960, time has moved incredibly fast for the Asian American theater corpus, and it's already gone through like 3 waves of styles. You've got the first wave, which is like Chicken Coop Chinaman, which I showed the image of, which is all about the immigrant experience and coming to America, and then you've got the second wave, which is by their children, basically writing about what it's like to be in 2 places culturally at once, and being in conflict with this supposed nostalgia that they're supposed to have for the old country and their current country that they're citizens of. And then the third wave, which is about reclaiming the idea of like Americanness and reinventing Americanness. And then there's like a fourth wave happening right now, which is just like very experimental. And one of the things that I was grappling with in my thesis was this question of how do I reconcile all these 3 different styles of activism at once, and like make commentary on the corpus as a whole through that. And yeah, it's surprising, like when you take a digital humanities perspective to it, it's surprising to see what similarities that there are common threads, and then those common threads also exist in the white American activist literature of the time period as well. Yeah, I guess in general, when it comes to the different waves of Asian American theater, I personally, as a current practitioner of Asian American theater, find the first wave to be very problematic. And there's this line from a fourth wave play, the Charlie Chan's Oriental Murder Mystery Express is the name of the play. And it talks about Charlie Chan, who's this effeminate detective written by Earl Derbiggers, who's a white American novelist, and how he's this effeminate, very emasculate detective who's like described as having very chubby cheeks and having the light, dainty step of a woman. And the original plays in the Asian American corpus, the first wave, was battling against that as the image, and that as a specter for that first wave that's why all of their literature is about, very directly being a very reactionary kind of body of literature. So, yeah, I guess I don't know where I was going with that, but just that the historicism is there in trying to find how these different waves of literature in such a compact amount of time, like 40 to 50 years, developed and then created what is now like it is an American corpus with American stylistics. Yeah.
I think with that, I'm going to conclude by thanking you all again. from my heart, personally, working with these students is a dream, as you've probably noticed. Directing the honors program is a wonderful opportunity for me to learn so much about entire areas of literature that, as a modernist, as a British critic of British history, I don't normally study. So thank you, as always. But also I wanted to pull out a thread that was consistent in all of your commentary, which was how important the English department faculty have been to all of you. All of those moments where you've sat in a professor's office and suddenly you've had that desire to keep talking and to push the envelope and to go back to your rooms and go back and find the spaces in the library. I think I give credence to the power of this community in your development as scholars, and of course as graduates on the threshold of a new phase of your lives. So many of our students are going on to great adventures. We have a Fulbright scholar sitting in front of us. We have publications coming out of theses already. That is the big doorstopper footnote in Will's thesis. We have graduate school on the horizon, Texas and Oxford. We have people going into industry who have gotten into very competitive training programs in industry. And we have people beginning internships. So it's been not just a thesis year for all of you, but a year in which you've set the foundation for your future. So I wish you luck, and all of you here in the audience, and thank you all. And we'll meet this time next year with a new crop. Thank you.